Prague, May 23, 1618. Three men are thrown out of a window. They fall 70 feet, land in a pile of garbage and horse manure below the castle walls, somehow survive. Catholics immediately declare this a miracle. God protected his servants. Protestants declare it proof that God has abandoned the Catholics. Even their falls are pathetic. This argument about a window will start a war that kills 8 million people, destroys 20% of Germany's entire population, creates famine across Central Europe, produces refugee crises that dwarf anything the continent has seen, and lasts 30 years because no side can win and no side will stop. This is the 30 Years' War, the most destructive conflict in European history before the World Wars, started over religious window defenestration, fueled by economic competition disguised as religious conviction, and ended only when everyone ran out of money, soldiers, and populations to destroy. But here is what they do not tell you about the 30 Years' War. It was not really a religious war. It was an economic war, a geopolitical struggle for control of Central Europe, dressed in religious clothing because religious clothing made soldiers willing to die. This is the story of how a window started the most catastrophic war in European history, how religious conviction became economic warfare, and how a conflict that began with 3 men falling into manure ended with 8 million dead and the complete restructuring of European power. But before understanding how religion became the perfect cover for economic conquest, we need to see why Europe in 1618 was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Europe in 1618 is a continent divided by religion and united by debt. The Protestant Reformation began 100 years earlier. Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 split Christianity. Catholics and Protestants are not just theologically divided, they are economically and politically divided. Catholic regions are controlled by the Habsburg dynasty. Austria, Spain, large parts of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs are the most powerful political entity in Europe, and they are militantly Catholic. Protestant regions are emerging powers: the Dutch Republic, Northern German princes, Swedish Empire, Danish Kingdom, England. These are rising economic forces, challenging Habsburg dominance through trade, banking, and military innovation. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 temporarily solved the religious conflict. Each German prince can choose his territory's religion. Cuius regio, ius religio, whose region, his religion. This created stability for 60 years. But stability masked underlying tensions. Protestant princes are gaining economic power. Habsburg Catholic dominance is weakening. Trade routes are shifting. The Dutch Republic is becoming the world's leading economic power, and the Habsburgs are watching their dominance erode. The religious conflict is real. People genuinely believe in their faith, are genuinely willing to die for it, but the political and economic stakes are enormous. Whoever controls Central Europe controls trade routes between Mediterranean and Northern Europe, controls silver flows from Spanish-American colonies, controls the grain trade feeding the continent. This is wealth on continental scale. Religion provides the ideology, economics provides the motive, and a window provides the trigger. The defenestration of Prague is not spontaneous, it is calculated provocation. The Holy Roman Emperor Matthias is dying. His chosen successor is Ferdinand of Styria. Archduke Ferdinand is aggressively Catholic, has already forced reconversion of Protestant populations in his territories, is promising to restore Catholic dominance across the empire. Protestant Bohemian nobles panic. They have religious freedoms guaranteed by the Letter of Majesty from 1609. Ferdinand's track record suggests he will eliminate those freedoms immediately upon becoming emperor. They decide to make a statement, send their representatives to confront the royal governors at Prague Castle, accuse them of violating Protestant rights, put them on trial, find them guilty, and then throw them out the window. This is not mob violence, this is deliberate political theater. The defenestration is a declaration: we will not accept Catholic Habsburg domination, we are willing to start a war over this. The 3 men fall 70 feet, land in a moat filled with garbage, survive with minor injuries. Catholic propagandists immediately publish pamphlets claiming divine intervention. God caught them, protected his servants. This proves Catholic righteousness. Protestant propagandists publish counter pamphlets. They survived because they landed in manure. God abandoned them, left them to fall into filth. This proves Protestant righteousness. Two sides, same event, opposite interpretations, maximum provocation, and the war begins. But this religious argument is actually a proxy for something else entirely. Bohemia offers its crown to Frederick V of the Palatinate. Frederick is Protestant, leader of the Protestant Union, son-in-law of King James I of England. If Frederick accepts the Bohemian crown, it breaks Habsburg control of the Holy Roman Empire's electoral system. The Holy Roman Emperor is elected by 7 electors, currently 4 Catholic, 3 Protestant. If Frederick takes Bohemia, it becomes 4 Protestant, 3 Catholic, and the Habsburgs lose the ability to guarantee Catholic emperors forever. This is not about religion, this is about structural power, electoral control, dynastic supremacy. The Habsburgs cannot allow this to happen. Bohemia must remain Catholic. Habsburg power depends on it. Ferdinand, now Emperor Ferdinand II, mobilizes the Catholic League. Spain sends money and troops. The Pope sends money and blessing. Bavaria sends its army. Frederick accepts the Bohemian crown, becomes the Winter King. His Protestant allies promise support. England promises support. The Dutch Republic promises support. Then nobody sends help. Frederick fights alone. His army faces the Catholic League at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. The battle lasts 1 hour. Protestant forces collapse completely. Frederick flees. The Winter King reigned for 1 winter. Bohemia is reconquered. Protestant leaders are executed in Prague's town square. 27 heads displayed on the Charles Bridge. The Counter-Reformation begins. Bohemia is forcibly recatholicized. Protestant nobles lose their lands, their wealth confiscated, their churches converted. And the Protestant powers of Europe watch this happen and realize something terrifying. If the Habsburgs successfully reconquer Bohemia, they will do the same to every Protestant territory. This is not just religious persecution. This is systematic economic expropriation, taking Protestant wealth and transferring it to Catholic loyalists. The war that seemed over after White Mountain is actually just beginning. Because economic self-preservation will bring every Protestant power into the conflict. Denmark enters the war in 1625 and immediately loses. King Christian IV of Denmark sees opportunity. The war has weakened the Holy Roman Empire. Protestant princes need support. If Denmark leads Protestant resistance, Christian can expand Danish territory and control Baltic trade routes. This is not religious motivation, this is economic calculation. Control of Baltic trade means controlling grain shipments feeding all of Europe. This is strategic economic prize. Christian sends his army into northern Germany, meets imperial forces under Count Tilly and the mercenary general Wallenstein, gets destroyed. Battle of Lutter 1626, Danish army annihilated, Christian barely escapes, imperial forces push north, occupy Denmark's German territories, threaten the Danish mainland. The Peace of Lubeck 1629 ends Danish involvement. Christian keeps Denmark but loses his German territories, gains nothing, loses everything he risked. But Ferdinand makes a catastrophic mistake after his victory. Emboldened by success, he issues the Edict of Restitution. All church property secularized since 1552 must return to Catholic control. This is not religious policy. This is the largest property confiscation in European history. Hundreds of monasteries, thousands of church lands, enormous wealth transfers from Protestant to Catholic hands. Protestant princes who were not fighting now have to fight. Their economic survival is at stake. The Edict of Restitution transforms a religious political conflict into an existential economic war. And it brings the most effective military force in Europe into the conflict. Sweden enters the war in 1630, and everything changes. King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden is genuinely Protestant, genuinely religious. But he is also the greatest military innovator of the 17th century. and Sweden has economic interests in Baltic trade that Catholic Habsburg dominance threatens directly. Gustavus lands in Germany with a revolutionary army, not mercenaries fighting for pay, national soldiers fighting for country and faith, trained differently, equipped differently, funded differently. He introduces mobile artillery, lighter cannons that can keep up with infantry. This is revolutionary. Artillery in 1630 is slow, heavy, requires hours to position. Gustavus's artillery moves with the battle. He introduces combined arms tactics. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery coordinated together, each supporting the others. This is not new in theory, but Gustavus executes it at scale that defeats every opponent. His army moves faster, reloads faster, maneuvers faster. Swedish forces tear through imperial armies in engagement after engagement. Battle of Breitenfeld 1631. Gustavus defeats Tilly's Catholic League army, first major Protestant victory in a decade. The entire character of the war shifts. Protestant forces are not just surviving, they are advancing. Gustavus pushes deep into Germany, threatens Munich, threatens Vienna itself. Ferdinand is facing military catastrophe. And then Gustavus Adolphus dies at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, shot in the back while leading a cavalry charge in fog, killed at the moment of greatest Swedish advantage. Sweden continues fighting, but the strategic genius is gone. The war grinds into attritional slaughter that neither side can win. But here is what the war has now become, something far more destructive than a religious or political conflict. The 30 Years' War becomes an economic catastrophe machine. Armies in this era do not have reliable supply chains, they feed themselves by looting civilian populations. This is not aberration, this is military doctrine. Armies march, find food in villages, take everything, move on. When armies fight over the same territory repeatedly, the result is absolute economic destruction. Farmers stop farming. Why plant crops that armies will steal? Merchants stop trading. Why stock goods that soldiers will loot? Craftsmen stop producing. Why create valuables that will be confiscated? Economic activity collapses in war zones, and war zones expand to cover most of Central Europe. Germany is hit hardest. German population in 1618 is approximately 18 million. By 1648, it has fallen to maybe 13 or 14 million, 4 to 5 million people dead, not mostly in battles, mostly from famine, disease, and cold following economic collapse. Some German regions lose 60% of their populations, entire cities emptied, villages abandoned, agricultural land returning to forest because no one is left to farm it. This is not collateral damage. This is systemic economic destruction creating cascading civilizational collapse. When farmers die or flee, food production stops. When food production stops, famine begins. When famine weakens populations, disease spreads. When disease spreads, more people die, the cycle accelerates. And the mercenary armies make it worse. Wallenstein commands imperial forces not through Habsburg pay but through systematic looting. His army lives off conquered territories. He is running economic extraction operations disguised as military campaigns. A territory occupied by Wallenstein's army is stripped of everything: food, livestock, metal goods, jewelry, timber, labor, everything of value extracted and used to fund further military operations. This is military capitalism, using war to fund war, using looted resources to pay soldiers who loot more resources. The war becomes self-sustaining through extraction. Impossible to end because ending it means ending the economic model supporting the armies. And then France enters and removes any possibility of quick resolution. France enters the war in 1635, Catholic France supporting Protestants. This makes no theological sense. France is Catholic, the Habsburgs are Catholic, they should be allies against Protestant heretics. But Cardinal Richelieu, France's chief minister, does not care about theology, he cares about power, and Habsburg dominance of Central Europe threatens French power regardless of religion. If the Habsburgs control the Holy Roman Empire and Spain simultaneously, France is surrounded, economically strangled, strategically trapped. the religious dimension is irrelevant to French geopolitical calculation. Richelieu has been funding Protestant powers since 1630, paying Sweden to fight, paying German princes to resist, using Protestant soldiers to bleed Habsburg power without committing French troops. But by 1635, this proxy strategy is not working fast enough. France enters directly, commits its own armies, and the war that was already catastrophic becomes continental. Now the war is France versus the Habsburgs, with religion as justification, with Protestant German princes as French allies, with Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs fighting together, with Sweden still fighting in northern Germany, with Denmark occasionally involved. With the Pope funding Catholic forces, with Dutch Republic funding Protestant forces. This is a world war in 17th century terms, every European power involved. Multiple theaters, interconnected but uncoordinated campaigns, and no mechanism for peace because everyone still believes winning is possible. But nobody is winning, everybody is losing, and the populations of Central Europe are paying the price. By 1640, everyone wants to stop, nobody knows how. The war has its own momentum. Mercenary armies need to keep fighting to get paid. Military commanders have built power bases dependent on continued conflict. Economic interests tied to war industries resist peace. Spain is bankrupt, has defaulted on debts multiple times, cannot fund the war but cannot stop because stopping means accepting defeat. Habsburg prestige cannot survive surrender. The Holy Roman Empire is shattered, dozens of German princes fighting each other and everyone else. Imperial authority has effectively collapsed. The emperor cannot command his own vassals. France is winning militarily but exhausted economically. Richelieu is dead. His successor Mazarin wants peace but from a position of strength, cannot stop while victory seems achievable. Sweden is fighting over German territories it wants to keep. Peace means negotiating those gains. Stopping fighting means losing negotiating leverage. Nobody can stop, and nobody can win. The war continues because the economic and political mechanisms for ending it do not exist yet. So they invent them out of absolute necessity, out of exhaustion, out of the realization that continuation means mutual extinction. The Peace of Westphalia 1648 ends the war and invents the modern world. Negotiations begin in 1644. Take 4 years, involve nearly every European power, and produce 2 treaties that fundamentally restructure European politics. This is the first time in history that European powers negotiate comprehensive peace in a Congress, sit at the same table, recognize each other's sovereignty, agree on rules for international relations. The Peace of Westphalia establishes principles that govern international relations for the next 4 centuries. State sovereignty, every ruler controls their own territory. No external power, including the Pope, can interfere in another state's domestic affairs. This ends papal authority over political decisions. The Pope is furious, calls the treaties null and void, nobody cares. Religious tolerance, princes can choose their state religion but cannot force conversion of populations. Religious minorities have legal protections. This ends the principle that religious unity is required for political stability. Diplomatic recognition. States recognize each other's legitimacy regardless of ideology. Catholic and Protestant states are equals in international law. This creates the framework for secular international relations. Balance of power. No single power should dominate Europe. Other powers can form alliances to prevent dominance. This principle directly targets Habsburg supremacy and will govern European diplomacy until World War I. These are revolutionary principles, not just for ending one war, for preventing future wars, for creating a system where conflicts can be resolved without exterminating populations. And they emerge from the most destructive war Europe has ever seen because by 1648, everyone understands that the alternative to these principles is civilizational collapse. The war that started with a window ended by building the architecture of the modern world. The 30 Years' War teaches lessons that modern powers are ignoring. Religious and ideological conflicts are almost always economic conflicts in disguise. The 30 Years' War was about Habsburg dominance of European trade and political structures. Religion provided the motivation that made soldiers die for economic interests they did not understand. Modern conflicts follow the same pattern: religious or ideological framing disguising resource competition, control of oil fields framed as liberation of oppressed peoples, control of trade routes framed as spread of democracy, control of rare earth minerals framed as combating terrorism. The ideology is real, people genuinely believe, but the economic interests driving political decisions are equally real, and the ideology makes rational economic negotiation impossible because you cannot compromise with heresy or evil. The war became unstoppable because ideological framing removed rational calculation. You cannot negotiate with the devil, you cannot compromise with heresy, you cannot accept less than total victory over existential evil. But the populations dying were not fighting ideological abstractions. They were dying from famine and disease following economic collapse. They were victims of resource extraction by mercenary armies. They were casualties of geopolitical competition between rulers who framed their ambitions in religious language. 20% of Germany's population dead, not from battles, from what war does to economic systems. And here is the modern parallel that should concern every observer of contemporary conflicts. Ideological wars that destroy economic infrastructure kill more people than bullets. Syria lost 60% of its economic capacity in a civil war framed as democracy versus authoritarianism. The real conflict is regional power competition between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, and the United States, all using Syrian territory for geopolitical competition, all framing intervention in ideological terms, all contributing to economic destruction that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. Yemen is fighting a war framed as Iranian-backed Houthi rebellion versus Saudi-backed legitimate government. The real conflict is Saudi-Iranian geopolitical competition for regional dominance. The Yemeni population is experiencing 30 Years' War dynamics: famine, disease, economic collapse, not primarily from bombs but from what war does to food production, trade, and economic activity. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, all conflicts framed ideologically, all fundamentally about geopolitical and economic competition, all demonstrating the 30 Years' War pattern. Ideological framing prevents rational settlement. War continues past any point of strategic logic. Populations pay catastrophic prices for great power competitions conducted on their territory. The Peace of Westphalia's great innovation was separating ideology from political decision-making. Accepting that states have different religions, different ideologies, different systems, and that international relations must function between ideologically incompatible powers. Modern conflicts keep violating this principle, keep framing geopolitical competition in ideological terms that make compromise impossible, keep continuing past rational strategic endpoints because ideology demands total victory, and keep killing civilian populations through economic destruction while political leaders debate theology or democracy or human rights. 8 million people died because a religious dispute made rational economic negotiation impossible. And the pattern continues. Every generation, every ideological conflict, every war that cannot end because ending requires compromising with evil. The window in Prague did not start the war. The inability to separate economic interests from ideological convictions started the war. The window was just the spark in a room full of gunpowder that religion and economics spent a century accumulating. Modern rooms are just as full of gunpowder, modern sparks are just as available, and modern populations are just as vulnerable to what happens when ideology makes economic warfare into holy crusade. 3 men thrown from a window started 30 years of catastrophe. History keeps asking how this is possible, and history keeps answering, when you cannot separate what you believe from what you want, any spark will do.